Hello, I'm Annie Graham Larkin, Executive Director of the Bisbee Mining and Historical Museum. Welcome to The Influence of Bisbee's Miners and Mining Companies on Museums with Richard W. Graeme IV. Thank you to our program sponsor, the Arizona Historical Society, as well as our members and donors who enable the museum to provide free online programming and fulfill the organization's mission to discover history, explore Bisbee's past today. To learn how you can assist the museum in supporting its mission and programs by becoming a member or donor, please visit bisbeemuseum.org. On Saturday, March 16th at 11 a.m., the museum will host the free online program, The Bisbee Massacre, with historian David Grosset. Please visit the event section of the Bisbee Mining and Historical Facebook page for more information. All right. So Richard W. Graeme IV was born in Bisbee, Arizona. By the time he was 6, he was collecting minerals underground with his father and twin brother. Minerals and mining were a focal point of his youth, with many hundreds of hours spent underground in Bisbee and other Western mining areas collecting minerals and mining artifacts. In 1986, along with his twin brother, he collected what is surely Bisbee's finest cuprite specimen, along with exceptional examples of some of the rarest copper minerals. Rich has worked in mines in Alaska, Colorado, California, and New Mexico. He would also work in Bisbee at the Queen Mine Tours as a guide, where he put his knowledge base to full use. Because of the difficult times in the domestic mining industry, Rich switched from a mining major to education, and he earned his education degree from the University of Arizona in 1999. He has been teaching for 25 years in Sierra Vista, Arizona, and during this time, he has authored and co-authored several books and articles, including The Mineralogy of Bisbee, Arizona, Volumes 1 and 2, Seven Bells, Mine Accidents at Bisbee, Arizona, and Forgotten Caves of Bisbee, Arizona. And if you would like to ask questions during the program today, please type your questions in the Q&A chat box. We'll gather those questions to share with our speaker after the presentation. Also, a link to today's recording of the program will be sent to all of our Zoom registrants later today. And with that, I'd like to welcome Richard Graeme. Thanks, Rich.
Well, good morning, and hope you're having a great Saturday. And as Annie said, we're going to look at the influences of museum on Bisbee miners and mining companies. But before we head down that path, we need to step back just a second and look at and understand that mineralogically, Bisbee, Arizona is one of the most significant in the world. It's without a doubt in the top 5 mineralogies or mineral locations in the world, largely because of its complexity. We had a lot of bromine, a lot of tellurium, iridium, bismuth, odd minerals or metals are shot through into the surrounding rocks by the geologic forces. So we take that and then we blend in that not only was the minerals of Bisbee very diverse, but they were also tended to be very attractive. So they gained a lot of interest early on. So museums were definitely interested in Bisbee from the very early days. Also, we'll look at, and we need to understand, between 1910 and 1915, the mines in Bisbee truly reached their technological peak. They were one of the most modern mines in the world for this very short period of time. And we'll look at that as well. So before we go too far, let's look at Bisbee itself. We have, of course, the community of Bisbee right here, Bisbee proper. And we're going to actually look over in here at the major mining areas. We have the Copper Queen mine, the original Copper Queen mine, which operated for a very short period of time right here. We have the Czar right here. And then most of our focus will be over here in the Gardner and the 2 Holbrook mines and the Spray. There was another section of Bisbee with Lowell and Jiggerville a little bit further away. And this photograph was taken from the South Bisbee area, so it's sort of an odd view. It was taken by the same photographer around the same time, but it's looking the opposite direction. And it shows the area where the lavender pit is today. Most of this is completely gone. The first museum we're going to talk about is the American Museum of Natural History. And as a child, I was confused a little bit why the American Museum of Natural History received a very large collection of Bisbee minerals where the Smithsonian did not. And I thought that was confusing, but as I did a little research, it became very evident why. The family that made the Phelps Dodge company, the mercantile company, which is before the mining company, was largely involved in it. They became involved in the American Museum before it was a museum. They started with the in 1869, developing the concept of the museum and then getting legislation passed to provide for it. And then they contributed as well. So, and of course, 1870 is before the building was even constructed. They did not have a building at that time. They were still in the fundraising. You can see Anson Phelps Dodge here, his son, William E. Dodge, his father, Isaac Newton Phelps, and, grandfather, and then his in-law, or his daughter and son-in-law, James Stokes, his business partner and cousin, Daniel Willis James, and his grandson, William E. Dodge. And I used Anson Dodge as the sort of the reference point. The relationships are based on to him. And Anson Phelps Dodge was on the board of trustees in 1870. And then by 1911, you're still seeing a large number of Phelps Dodge related people. We had Cleveland H. Dodge, the great grandson of Anson. We had Arthur Curtis James, which is a cousin to Cleveland Dodge. And we had James Douglas. The Walter James listed, as far as I know, is at most a very distant relative. But you can see some very important people on there. There's A.D. Juilliard. There's J.P. Morgan. There is Theodore Roosevelt. Now, understand, this is the president's father. This is not Theodore Roosevelt Jr., who became the president of the United States. We are talking about Sr., who is his father. You can see Henry Frick from the Frick Gallery. Some really important people in the way of museums and philanthropy. The American Museum collection really, at least their Bisbee component, really started with the collection that was built for the Columbian Exposition. They received a substantial part of that collection. And one of the most famous pieces you can actually see off in the distance, and it's covered in canvas. It's a 3.5 ton block of azurite and malachite, which has been the focal point of the American Museum Mineral Collection for several decades. In this case, it's just recently been removed from the mine, and then they covered it with canvas to protect it. And we can see the boulder, uncovered, of course. This upper obelisk section no longer exists, but the bottom major block is still in existence. And I think the most impressive thing, other than the size, remember, they're showing ore at this point. They weren't necessarily interested in its specimen quality. They were showing off the richness of the mine. And a 3.5 ton block of azurite is rather impressive. Equally as impressive is how they got it out, because it came off the 300 level Holbrook. So it's, 300 feet underground. And if it was in a stope, they would have had to have dropped it to a level to remove. The restrictions on the size of the block were probably so it could go onto a mine cage. That would be about as big as you could comfortably get a block to get it out of the mine. This is a photograph of the Chicago Exposition, and at this little section right here, you can see the block as a central display. And this, of course, is the photograph was taken in 1893. It's the Arizona section, so all of the minerals that you're seeing in the cases would have been from Arizona, but only a part of them would have been from Bisbee, but a very impressive part. And you can see the block. We have the 2024 image, which is the mineral hall has been recently revamped and redesigned. And so that's what it looks like today. And then we have the 2006, which shows what it was looked like when they redid it in the 1970s. And in my sense, the most interesting is the one in the 1920s, which it was just part of a regular exhibit. And you can see a large number of very interesting Bisbee specimens surrounding it. The stalactites hanging from the ceiling would have been tinted green. They would not have been your normal brown or white stalactites. And then you have a large number of azurites and malachites and a few calcites down at the bottom. Now, as you can see, the block is somewhat porous. Originally, it would have been filled with azurite and malachite, much like this. Very acicular, very fine, very soft. This piece actually came from 100 feet below where the block came out of, and in the same stope, though, same ore body, it was just 100 feet vertically below it. And so most of the pockets would have been filled with material like this. But time has pretty much damaged them, and it just makes a very impressive ore sample. I'm not sure anywhere in the world could produce a sample like that today. So it's very interesting. And it was, again, donated by the Copper Queen Consolidated Mining Company right after the exposition. But it was more than just the block. There were dozens upon dozens of very fine specimens, and there was a very strong preference for azurite and malachite. As you can see, this case right here is just filled with azurite and malachites, as it was in 1925. Now, since 1925, the focuses of the American Museum has changed. And I would say the far majority of these specimens are no longer owned by the American Museum. This specimen up here in color, the malachite from the Czar, used to belong to the American Museum, and it used to be a part of a much larger malachite, maybe 3 or 4 times that size, so 2.5 feet across. It was broken, and this piece was sold, and I have no idea what happened to the other part. The American Museum sold off a substantial amount or traded off of their Bisbee, but Bisbee was not necessarily their focus. They have a large gem collection, so they were probably looking at obtaining things like Columbian emeralds and minerals that were coming out that were more modern in the 20th century. And so you can see what the collection looks like today. It still has some very fine pieces in it. There's a couple of azurites and malachites that are very nice, but it's still a faint comparison to what it used to be. Because undoubtedly it was the finest collection of Bisbee minerals in the world for a long time. Okay, and sometime after the 1920s, it really started to fall apart. Well, in the Bisbee sense, you would have to look at the collection as a whole, which is probably improved dramatically, just not in the Bisbee area. Also, a little bit later, around 1910, although, well, in 1910, a cave in Bisbee drew the interest of Edmund Otis Hovey, the curator of geology. Now, he had been at the museum before the turn of the century. He was very interested in caves. And Bisbee hits large numbers of caves. Now, many of them are like the one which the picture shows, is very traditional. It's creams and whites and browns and a few reds, and very typical cave-like. But in 1910, in the summer of 1910, they had struck a cave that had a strong influence of copper minerals. So it tended to be strong green tints. There were probably little specks of azurite in it. There were probably malachites exposed in it. And it was decided that this cave was going to be dismantled, or at least what they considered the desirable sections of the cave to be dismantled and shipped to New York and rebuilt as an exhibit. And even the surrounding limestone blocks were mined out and shipped to New York to sort of complete the picture, so you would see the natural surrounding limestones. And you can see a photograph right here of the men working on the exhibit. And it would have been filled in with calcites that were green in color largely, like the ones that are shown. The three in the center are not from the actual cave. The large stalagmite in the corner is. It is still in the American Museum collection, although it's been put out where people can touch and feel it, so it's rather grease covered from the years, but it's still impressive. It's rather large, about 4 feet tall. But at the time, Otis Hovey had seen it. He said it was the most beautiful cave he had seen. And again, it's because of the rich colors. Now, the cave was dismantled. It no longer exists. And in the 70s and 80s, the stalactites and stalagmites were sold off again to further the other areas of the American Museum collection. And one of my favorite elements, and this was financed by Dr. James Douglas, was the two mine models that they built. And again, this was in 1910. Bisbee was reaching its technological peak. It had a new haulage method. They were starting to really understand the geology of what was going on. And so let's take a look at that. The area, again, is going to be this area right here, where the model was created. From Google Earth, you can see the lavender pit, and here's Highway 80. So it's on the far side of the pit. It went from what was the Lowell mine, past the Gardner, and then over, did a jagged move past the Spray and up Uncle Sam Gulch to where the cuprite mine is today. Now, I imagine I have some Bisbee experts in the audience, so I prepared this just to prevent confusion. For most of the mining history, the Spray mine was an enclosed head frame, which we can see up in here. These enclosed head frames were copied after those in Michigan and were designed for intense weather. And you can see the Spray being built, and you can see the steel gallows frame hidden inside, or about to be hidden. Well, Bisbee does not have those harsh weather, so they eventually dismantled that and just left the head frame exposed, like most of the head frames in Bisbee. Unfortunately, photographs of the Spray that are not enclosed are extremely rare, so it's easy to confuse the Spray with another mine. I think there's 1 or 2 photographs known of the Spray without its head frame. And this picture right here is just a few months before this was to be dismantled and covered by the dumps of the Sacramento pit. The head frame itself, the steel structure, was taken to the Calumet and Cochise shaft. And then after the Calumet and Cochise shaft no longer needed it, in the 1970s, it was put on top of the Shattuck shaft. And that's where it remains today, hidden up Uncle Sam Gulch. So if you're really familiar with Bisbee and know about the Spray, don't get confused, because it did for a very short period of time, was operated as an unenclosed head frame. And we have the Spray right here. And this is one of the models, and then the Lowell's right over here, and then the Gardner mine is right over here. And you can see the porphyry and then the influence of the hydrothermal fluids and replacing the copper minerals, replacing the limestones and things of that nature down in there. There was another model built at the same time, and it's this one right here. It shows the spray head frame, and it shows just some of the stoping that was going on in there. And we'll look at it a little bit closer. Even though the mine was technologically advanced, the actual mining underground in the stope area was using square sets, which is a very old method of mining, you know, building these cubes of 8x8 or 10x10 timber, mining it and then filling it full of waste rock and then building more sets. Very old method. They couldn't get away from it. The ground in Bisbee was too heavy. It was the only economical way to mine it. On the right side, we have what I would consider a very typical model. That's what most museums would build, a little square set stope. What I find totally extraordinary is the one on the left side, which tells me that the people truly understood what they were creating. Because this is a stope that's beginning to cave, and all of the square sets are being crushed out of shape. The waste rock that filled the stope is being subsided, and you have this wonderful cavity opening up above, which is caving in. And then in this area, it shows a pillar in between the stope and what is referred to as the manway, and the chutes, and the pillars being crushed on top. And just an extraordinary model. They really, really understood what was going on in the mining. So as a mine model, it's probably the best one that was ever built in mining in Bisbee, although many others exist. Now, these two gentlemen did have influence on museums, but most of them were not going to be the focal point of this discussion because they're not really well understood. Ben Williams, which was the manager up until 1899, and his brother, the smelter superintendent, Lewis Williams, also superintendent until 1899. They donated to Yale, but for many years, the Yale collection was in storage, and I think a large part of the Bisbee is still in storage. They also had donated a large number of specimens to the State of California Museum. One of the most interesting was they described it as fossil plants replaced by malachite. They weren't plants, they were crinoids, but they looked like plants. If you're familiar with crinoids, you know, they have a long stem and they have a flower on top, or a structure called a flower. And so they're plant-like animals, and they still exist today. They're rare, but they used to be extremely abundant. In this lower sample here, you can see the round circles of broken crinoid stems that have been replaced by malachite, and there's a few cylindrical segments of the crinoid stems as well. So it's very, very easy for them to understand why they thought it was a plant. But in fact, it was truly an animal. The location of these pieces is tentatively unknown, where they ended up. Then we'll take a look at the Smithsonian. And the Smithsonian today has, without a doubt, the finest collection of Bisbee minerals in existence. And part of that, most of it is due to James Douglas, but part of it is due to a relatively unknown person, particularly outside of Bisbee, which would be William P. Crawford, a mine superintendent he worked in Bisbee from about 1924 into the early 1950s. Now, The first donation came from the Copper Queen Mining Company. Now, this is pre-1885, so Phelps Dodge was not even involved at this time. This is a very early mining company. You can see the Copper Queen shaft right here at the edge of the glory hole. But it would have been ore samples, okay? And the donation was from the Copper Queen had intended to display at the World's Fair in Louisiana. And they didn't get there in time, so they shipped the specimens to the Smithsonian or the U.S. National Museum. But they were more focused on ore, so what it consisted of were largely blocks of malachite, slag, copper matte, black copper produced from the smelter, which is just basically highly pure copper, like 98%, but it still has enough impurities to make it sort of black in color. Bars of black copper. But the malachite would not have been very pretty. You notice the malachite here has sort of an odd shade of green to it, not the bright, vibrant greens. That's very typical of early Copper Queen specimens. But it was James Douglas who really got things kicked off. In 1886, of course, he donated some specimens, and then he sent some cut polished stalactites. They don't note the species, but it would not be unexpected that azurite stalactites, malachite stalactites, as well as calcite stalactites were cut and polished. There is a cut and polished stalactite piece in the Bisbee Mining Historical Museum, and that could easily be one of the Douglas pieces. And then he continued to donate. I just listed a few, like the 1898 donation. But in 1945, long after he had passed away, his private collection was donated to the Smithsonian, and it forms the core of the Smithsonian Bisbee collection, and arguably it forms a major part of their mineral collection period. It is definitely a major highlight. And we'll take a look at some of these. Well, first we'll go look at what it looked like in the 1960s. The one case is azurite, malachite, and calcite. Being black and white, it's hard to tell what's what. But these are either azurite or malachites up in here. These two are calcites. Not much going on as far as native coppers or cuprites in here. But the nice thing is the Smithsonian owns the majority of these today. Now this case right here only has one large stalactite from Bisbee, and the other specimens are not from Bisbee. But we'll see this specimen a couple times further on. His personal collection and is on display. And sorry about the low quality of photographs. They had to be taken through the glass because they are on exhibit, and they're extremely fine specimens. This one right here, I would argue, is the finest botryoidal malachite in Bisbee. There's malachite pseudomorphs after azurite, and the finest of that is in a different museum. But there's some incredible pieces in here. And here's some more that you can see. Really fine azurites, and these are large. These are 6-7 inches across. They're not small, and these cuprite crystals go up to, greater than a 1/4 inch, probably 3/8. So there's some extremely fine pieces. And this is that one big azurite that's in the other picture, the black and white one right here. It's a couple feet across, and we had it out to install into the exhibit which exists today. I helped with my father and brother on that exhibit. And you can see it right here. You can see the large azurite as it's being installed. There was still a lot of work to be done on the exhibit. You can see the foam that hasn't been covered yet. And then in this other picture, it's in the early stages of the construction of the actual exhibit, because most of the stalactites are still warm. But They have a wonderful exhibit there, and it's been largely retained by the museum. They've done an excellent job as caretakers. The other person that did a lot for the Smithsonian is sort of an odd character, and I don't think he's gotten any credit really, is William P. Crawford. He was sort of I gather he was an odd duck. I mean, my father knew him. He had passed on before I was around or old enough to recognize him. He's started sending specimens to the Smithsonian in 1924. But as I said, he's unusual. He had just a different way of looking at it. I suspect he had a really high IQ, a genius IQ. He did major things for Bisbee. He really pushed for calyx drills underground, which reduced the mining cost significantly. These are driving shafts where you could dump rock to different levels. Instead of driving the small tunnels, which you will see at the Queen Mine Tour, he believed in driving these large tunnels, 15 by 15 feet, where you could move 5-ton mine cars through them in large numbers, and that way reduce your cost by just the sheer amount of tonnage you're moving. And arguably, the most significant is this structure right here. In a really brilliant move, the PD management, Phelps Dodge management, realized that after World War II, scrap copper was going to flood the market. I mean, everybody's going to be melting down their shell casings and scrapping tanks. And so the copper market was going to plummet into nothing. And he recognized that. So they took the Sacramento concentrator, which is right here. This is from the Sacramento pit. They salvaged part of it, put it in this new building, which is called, locally, in Bisbee, it's called the Crawford Mill. And it was a lead zinc mill. So they switched after World War II, and they stopped mining copper pretty much. And they converted to only mining lead and zinc for 5 to 6 years. And that really saved Bisbee. If they hadn't done that, they would have shut down at that point. And he was odd. He was from West Virginia. He talked like a coal miner, which was sort of annoying because he did not blend well with the typical Bisbee mining terminology. He had used terms like pillows and barrels, which had very different terms in Bisbee. And when he was writing professionally, he wrote beautifully, used very professional terms. But when he was talking to a regular or writing to a regular mining audience, his West Virginia coal mining went into it really quick, which is confusing to somebody used to Bisbee mining terms. But he was very remarkable in what he saved. He just kept sending specimens to the Smithsonian, and they were really exciting things. This Tyumunite, I hopefully am pronouncing that right, is one of the copper uranyl vanidates. He was sending this to Smithsonian. For Bisbee, it's an extremely rare mineral found in the coal and some in the Campbell, and then he founded uranophyllite and was sending it. Ciangrite, another copper uranyl vanadate, was also sent. He was sending heterolites and hundreds of these beautiful little cerussite sixlings on native copper. And piercite is credited to him. It was not known from the district until he submitted it to the Smithsonian. Lead hillites, just hundreds of these relatively rare or downright rare minerals he was sending. And they acquired quite a few of them. He also was sending some better specimens, but personally, I appreciate the more rare, more unusual things that he sent. Now, before I forget, the uranophyllite is right here, natural light. This is long wave, short fluorescent light, and this is short wave. It's normally studied with fluorescent light to really grasp it. Like many of the uranium minerals, it's highly fluorescent. The last project that was supposed to go to the Smithsonian was the Shattuck Cave. It was hit in 1913. It was the largest cave in Bisbee. But for some reason or another, it never made it to the Smithsonian. Pieces were collected, and then it was shipped to the Michigan School of Mines, the samples. And I sort of understand why. The formations in here would have been very cave-like. They would have been traditional cream, browns, reds, and like most cave minerals, they don't particularly look very attractive or hold much interest outside of the cave itself. So they're better left in the cave if the cave can be preserved. This cave was later backfilled because just like that square set stope that caved in, this cave did the same thing. And so they backfilled as much as they could. They were not able to fill it in completely just by the sheer tonnage. And the upper part of the cave has caved in considerably. Actually, it's caved in all the way to the surface and in places. My favorite collection that has been preserved is actually at Harvard. And they do have some wonderful, beautiful things. But largely they were donated by wealthy Eastern collectors like the azurite that we see here and the malachite. They were just very wealthy men who purchased the specimens and donated them. You can see another selection right here of specimens that were collected and donated. Where I think Harvard has a true treasure is in a donation made by the Copper Queen Consolidated Mining Company. And to most people, they're not that interesting, but if you're looking at the true scientific end of Bisbee, this is an absolute gem. Okay, they collected, well, let me step back. 3 major mineralogy studies have been done in Bisbee, district-wide. And they all were between 2 and probably close to 3,000 specimens. One was this, the samples that we're seeing here are from the first one that was started in 1910, went to about 1914, 1915, and it is preserved. The other 2, as far as I know, no longer exist. One was done in the late teens, 17, 18 into the early 20s. And then the last one, which my father was part of, with Dr. Phil Motter and Dr. Sid Williams, was done in 74 and 75, 1974 and 75. And those, I believe, are gone as well. The importance is not necessarily the specimen itself, is the information it gives with it. They're very detailed labels. The intent is that a person could return to the spot and collect more if it was needed to be. And so normally the directions on these labels hit you within 3 or 4 feet, in the worst case, 30 feet of where the specimen was removed. That today gives you some major advantages, particularly in sulfides like this boronite and chalcopyrite. This is where often things like tellurium and uranium and like iridium can be found. And if you're wanting to understand that or how it was distributed from the district wide, how the solutions carried it and where it carried it, you need to look at that, and having the exact location is really crucial for that kind of study. So they have most of the 2,000 specimens. They're not on exhibit, they're in a warehouse, but they're absolutely wonderful to go through and look at. So that is my personal favorite collection that's out there. Now, when I started this, I realized that I had opened up more than I could really handle, because all of a sudden, I started asking myself, where did the specimens from the Paris School of Mines come from? Where did the specimens at the Sorbonne come from in Paris? The British Museum, I knew that a large number were donated by James Douglas. And I don't think they have very many after that period. Looking at them, they're definitely, most of them are from the 1890s. There's one that looks like it came from 1915, 1916. The University of Arizona has a large number of specimens that were donated by miners and the company in itself. Denver Museum of Natural History, the Field Museum in Chicago, the Academy of Sciences in California, the New York Academy of Sciences. And the South African museums, which I don't know if it still goes by this, is the Natal Museum, a museum in India, the Indian State Museum also. And then there's some very interesting people that I need to look at further. Albert G. Watkins was killed underground in Bisbee, so there's not a lot known about him, but he was the employee that built the collection to be sent to the Pan American Exposition in San Francisco in 1915. But he was killed 2 or 3 weeks before the exhibition closed. So what happened to the specimens is not clear. But the museum in Bisbee does have a specimen that was owned by his brother, Bassett Watkins, who was a policeman in Bisbee during the teens. And he sold it to Michael Cunningham of the Bank of America. Well, that's where the Bank of America collection came from. John Schisler, some of you met, probably knew, he's the former mayor. He was sending some very wonderful pieces to the University of Arizona. And the two mineralogists, Sid Williams and Dr. Phil Motter, they also preserved hundreds and hundreds of specimens and were donating them. And these are just a few. You go into the miners like Angel Solace, to a lesser extent, Melvin Elkins, Winston and Merrill Elkins. There are just so many individual miners like Shorty Montoya that also collected specimens and ended up in museum possession. So are there any questions?
Oh, thank you, Richard. Yes, we do have questions. The first, it does call for some speculation.
Yes.
Do you think these donations were made out of pure preservation reasons, or did the companies have other reasons?
Well, that's going to vary from time period. The earlier the donation, like a donation in 1884, was trying to sell the mine. Because remember, the early Copper Queen Mining Company didn't really want to stay in the mining business. They wanted to sell the business and get out. Okay. And they were unable to sell the business until the Atlanta ore body was hit and then the merger occurred. So at that time, they were really trying to sell their mine. Okay. And there's little doubt that that was the purpose of that. But most of the other specimens that we see up until 1915, 1916, which is the major donations, it probably was for scientific purposes. And the reason being is that Phelps Dodge was a closely held company. It was held largely by family and a few men like James Douglas. They weren't interested in selling stock. They wanted to keep the mine themselves. And it wasn't until the beginning of the Sacramento pit that Copper Queen really became a public company where stock was sold, most likely to help pay for the equipment that was going to go into the Sacramento pit. The other interesting thing is that the Calumet and Arizona Mining Company did not push minerals really at all. Yet they would have had their own wonderful suite of materials themselves. So those were really not sold or for their benefit. And then by the time Phelps Dodge became really a public company, they stopped donating to museums. Part of it could be the generation. There was that sort of wonderment of natural history in the 1870s up into the 1890s, early 1900s that sort of died out somewhat. But so I think it's both. I think in the early years, they definitely were trying to make money. Later years, not so much.
Okay. The next question, in your opinion, what is the best museum collection outside of the United States?
Ooh, I am very fond of the British Museum. Okay, just in general. Uh, they have the new one in Beirut, which I have not been to, but it has most of their specimens out of the museum in Houston went there. So the finest Spanglite in the world, which is from Bisbee, is in Beirut right now. Yeah. I'm very fond of the British Museum, but I think the Paris School of Mines is really close.
And how did these minerals get up to the surface and why here in Bisbee?
Um, well, first of all, they became worth a lot of money very quickly. Um, an azurite, underground in Bisbee could increase your salary $2 or $3 per day. Okay, if you were in work area, a stope that was producing minerals, um, you know, a rather unattractive azurite would sell for 50 cents. And, that's a substantial part of their wage at this time when they're making $4 a day underground. So they would just remove it. They did sometimes put them in lunch boxes, but not necessarily, because unlike almost every other mining camp, they really didn't care if you took specimens out, because if you took a specimen out, its value in copper was very limited. Um, and so people were taking specimens out left and right, and they weren't necessarily small. I mean, they were, the classic example is one of the shift bosses wanted to take out a copper for his yard, and it weighed 200 or 300 pounds. It was a native copper, it was elemental copper, which the mining company wasn't particularly interested in anyhow. It would have been a hassle to deal with it at the smelter. So they threw it on a timber truck, which is a little mine car, rolled it on. And then remember, nobody can ride a cage with material. So they had to tie up the cage and let it be hoisted to the surface by itself. Somebody had to unload it. And so it was tying up equipment even. So typically, if you were not breaking a safety rule, you were getting your work done, it was a non-issue. You could take out specimens. That did become an issue in the pit with the turquoise, but open pit mines and their safety issues are very different than underground. Underground, you're typically very close to the problem and you have a greater understanding of the problem. In the area where the turquoise was, the pit wall was failing. And you could look at the pit wall and see where it did fail. And it actually slid during mining. So underground, they didn't care. They could take them out in their lunch boxes, which was common for smaller things, but larger things came out too, and large numbers of larger things, 2 feet across. And again, that could not go on a cage that had men on it. It had to ride a cage alone if it was bigger than could be put in a lunchbox.
And in your opinion, how can Bisbee take advantage of these worldwide displays to promote tourism today?
Well, they already accomplished one great task, is to put the display where it is. The Smithsonian has loaned the Bisbee Mining Historical Museum a fine selection of largely Douglas pieces, James Douglas pieces. Plus, they have the Bank of America collection and the Shattuck collection. And they formed a really good basis. So you have a good local display and you have to keep it there. I think people don't understand a lot of the Bisbee mineralogy, or they don't understand how important it is. It's up there with Sumeb and Franklin and Mount St. Hilaire. It's in that just elite group. So I don't think people generally understand that. Although some of that, it's little gray specks and rocks, and so they're not particularly attractive. But showing it off, just having multiple displays, and interest in minerals goes up and down. A couple years ago, it definitely was back up and very popular with, at least as a teacher with kids. All my kids had rocks in their pockets, and these are eighth graders, so it's a little weird for eighth graders to have rocks in their pockets, but they did, and now it's sort of mellowing out again. It's like a roller coaster. But I think the big thing is that the museum in Bisbee has an extremely fine collection on display for people to see. You know.
And do you think there's any possibility of any type of production starting up in Bisbee again?
Well, if you look historically, no mine ever sits unbothered for very long. So there is war, and technology has changed significantly. It just depends on the demand. And I think, how would I put this? There are some, I think it may be underground too. Environmentally, open pit mines are sort of losing their popularity. And there is some substantial ore bodies left underground in Bisbee. They would be mixed sulfides and oxides, so some pyrite-like materials, chalcopyrite, boronite. And then there's going to be some cuprite, azurite, and malachite in different areas. Now, the hills on the other side of Highway 80 that are red, yeah, they are full of disseminated chalcocite, which is a really high grade. Although it's disseminated, so it, you know, in tonnages is considered a low grade. I think it's a matter of time and environmental choice. It's there. I mean, you look at the mines in Europe, you know, a mine will run 100, 200 years and then it'll shut down. And then 100 or 200 years later, it's up again. Of course, they have much older mines than we have here. So it's just a matter of time and environmental decision. Because the reports on the early reports from the 1950s on mining the opposite side of the highway 80, which is the Cochise area, would put the top level of the top bench of the mine at OK Street. I'm not sure that would be received favorably by the public today.
And do you think there will ever be a chance to pull out rare earth minerals from Bisbee?
That is an interesting question, because I think they haven't found very many because they haven't looked for them. Okay. And I know the environment is not ideal. I think it's a possibility. I think there's other things that could be mined first. I mean, most people don't realize the amount of uranium available in Bisbee is significant in leach waters. In the ores themselves, it was just scattered. But for some reason, the water seeping through the ground, leaching through the ore, seems to concentrate it. And so there's actually quite a bit. So things like uranium, vanadium, manganese, some of these odd things will be of interest. And it's just a matter of time. But I don't think, well, I know for a fact, nobody looked for rare earth metals because the mineralogy work has been done, has always focused on the copper deposits. That's where the focus is. And money does drive a lot of research. And so right now, I think it's just unknown.
And I don't believe that you mentioned it, but in the slide that you are currently showing in the
Yes.
right-hand side of the Alfie Norval Museum, we see the Bisbee display there. So I know personally that you were involved in at least a portion of this section of the display. Can you
Mhm.
tell us a bit about that and maybe some of the other work that you've done with museums?
Well, of course, I helped with the Smithsonian exhibit. I did a little tiny bit at the museum, the Bisbee Museum of Natural History. And then we did a lot of work with the University of Arizona's Alfie Norval Museum. I worked basically the entire Bisbee display, choosing which pieces were going to go on. display which pieces were being used. And then the section that's shown in the picture, the area with the large azurite is supposed to represent a wall of a slope in Bisbee. And that was probably my biggest project on the in that museum. I worked at it, spent a lot of time in Tucson going to look at the display it was built with my brother and father. I wasn't alone on it. And it's just to represent what they look like, because it wasn't just a sheer wall of azurite. There were spots of azurite inside of iron oxides or manganese oxides. I think we chose iron oxides for the actual display. There's a little natural cave in one corner, which is very common. It was just to represent what the miners did. And then the drawing in the exhibit is one I did, a section of the elements of a mine, of how it worked underground, how it was mined underground. But we did the entire display, including the ones that you can't see. A good section of the museum. Yeah. And then I've done work, the Harvard, just discussions, mainly exchanging information with the former curator, Dr. Carl Francis.
And I wanted to tell you that we've had a lot of thank yous and compliments regarding how interesting your presentation, including from Eric Fritz,
Oh,
formerly of the Alfie Norval, and also from Camilla Kelly, who is the great-great-grandniece of Thomas Higgins. So,
oh,
yes,
very
yes.
nice.
Well,
Yeah.
Richard, let me see. And Miss Parker also just said very interesting. Thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you so much for your time today, Richard. We really appreciate you sharing your time and expertise with our audience.
Well, thank you, and you have a good afternoon.
I hope you do the same, and I hope all of you will join us on March 16th for our next online program examining the Bisbee Massacre with historian David Grosset. Thank you, everyone. Bye.